Hi, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and I am so excited you've joined me for this video tutorial from Annie's. Today, I'm making the Old Glory quilt designed by Julie Weaver. This stash-friendly quilt is made using just one block. Yes, just one block. And no worries, I'll guide you step by step in how to make it. Some of the techniques I'll be showing you include selecting and preparing stash fabrics for cutting, making a flying geese unit with stitch and flip corners, squaring a block to size, troubleshooting when your block isn't the correct size, and how to piece borders that fit perfectly every time. There is a lot to cover, so let's get started now. As we get started today, the first thing that we need to do is pull together the materials that we need to make the project. And in our instructional packet, it gives us a complete list of the materials that we need, and we're basically working with blues, reds, and then kind of a cream or a beige color that goes with that. I'm choosing to go with a very stash-friendly, scrappy look on the project that I'm working with. You can either use Fat Ace or you can pull scraps from your stash, and that's what I'm doing. So we want to have this really rustic look, but we need to make sure that all of our colors are playing well together, that all of our fabrics are of a similar intensity, a similar depth. So I've got my darker blues here, and I wanted to have the reds match that. So we're going with some deeper red colors with the deeper blue colors. So they're kind of balancing each other in the blocks. And then filling in with a cream. I went a little bit warmer with a beige. That just seemed to work better with the mix of fabrics that I had. We want to have a degree of contrast between them, but we don't want to have any particular fabric that when we look at it, it stands right out and is like, oh wow, you're very different from the rest as far as what the colors look like. Have that contrast, but not too much contrast. And if the scrappy look is not your thing, and you know what, I'm a plain scrappy person. I just can't throw everything together into the pot, and that is perfectly fine. You can use either same colored fabrics, all the blues, all the reds the same, all the cream the same for a very uniform look, or you can narrow down the number of fabrics that you're using so that you get that more cohesive look. And if the rustic color palette just is not your thing, you know what? Stick with me. I got a surprise for you when we get to the end, and it is going to just totally wow you on how you can use this same pattern, but with a different option in colorways. It'll be just a little surprise. We'll see it soon. Stay with me. Anyway, cutting instructions. That's what comes next. Once we've got our fabrics, we're going to be cutting them. Basically cutting lots of rectangles and lots of squares. So really pretty simple. One of the things that you want to make sure that you're doing for some tips for success is when you're pulling fabrics from the same colorway, I'm using a pin to secure all of them together here so that I have my larger square and my smaller squares all from the same colorway. Also, as I'm cutting the larger pieces for the border, use a Wonder Clip just to clip onto those. And that makes a really handy way to keep all of the pieces together that you're going to be using later on and save some frustration in where is that exact piece in that color that I need. Stash fabrics, they can be a little wrinkly. I will be the first to admit that mine are very wrinkly. So I'm going to pull my ironing mat over here real quick. And what I like to do to prep all of my stash fabrics, and you can use even small pieces like this for your stash fabric, give them a quick press. And then I come in with a little bit of a starch alternative, some type of spray that's going to give them a little bit more body. It's going to help us get rid of all those wrinkles so that we can get a very nice, accurate cut when we start cutting out all of our pieces. Always cut your largest pieces first. That way you're being a little bit more efficient. And you're going to have to make a decision on how small of a piece that you want to keep. One of the things that I have here when I'm cutting is just an old enamel bowl, and I'll lay it next to my cutting station. Any piece that is probably too small for me to keep, I just pitch into that, and then it can go into the trash later. But that way, if I do need to retrieve a piece, I don't have to go digging clear through the trash to find it. I've just got it right here. So for me, anything smaller than a 2.5-inch square, I discard just to try to keep my stash bins a little bit tidy and using bigger pieces that I need. But you'll go through and cut everything out that you need for the quilt. And then let's start right back in working on the blocks. As we're getting ready to start assembling the blocks, the first step that we're going to make is to make some flying geese units. And we're going to use what's called a stitch and flip method to make those, to put our corners onto it. So we'll start out with a 1.5 by 2.5 inch rectangle. And on our H squares, we're going to need to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner on the back side of those. And this is just as simple as taking our cutting grid or any type of straight edge. I like to use my cutting grid. Align the corners, and then just mark that straight line. I'm using a dark pen here just because I want to make sure that it shows up well for you so that you can see that. Typically what I'm going to use is the marker that provides me the least amount of mark on there so that I'm not leaving some residue into the fabric. We're going to position that right sides together. Pinning is optional. If you want to pin, go right ahead. If you don't, you don't have to, but we would just slide a pin through here, holding that in place. And what we're going to do is stitch right on the drawn line. Now, a tip for you, because this is a really fairly short distance that we're stitching, I like to reduce my stitch length. Normally, I'm stitching at 2.5 millimeters. I'm going to drop it down to 2 so that I've got a lot of stitches in there to help hold that short distance. When we get finished, we'll have a unit that looks like this, where we're stitched together. Next, what we're going to do is trim the section beyond our stitching. So we're going to take off this little bit of a corner here. Using my cutting grid, I am positioning my 1/4 inch line on the cutting grid right on my stitched line. I'm going to trim that little dog ear off. And then we're going to fold out the remaining section of that square, the triangle, and flip it out. And this is where we come up with the name stitch and flip. Going to press that. And then what we're doing is the exact same process, but on the opposite side, we've got our drawn line there. Going to pin it just to hold it in place. We want to make sure that all of our raw edges are even. And when we get done stitching it, it'll be that exact same process. We're going to cut and flip open, and then we will end up with a flying geese unit that looks like this. So we've got both triangles flipped and pressed out. I want to make sure that this is the correct size because we are working on diagonals there. It can be really easy for that to get a little bit off. So we're shooting for a 1.5 inch by 2.5 inch, which is going to be the same size as our initial rectangle that we started with. And I'm trimming off just the tiniest amount, just a few threads. And now we have our flying geese unit made, and we're going to follow our directions and end up making a total of 120 of those. Next in our instructions, we're going to move on to figure 3, and we'll be working on putting together the strips for the framing of the block. And simple as sewing one of the squares onto the end of our A, E, B, and F strips. And we're going to want to do that for all of the blocks that we're making. One of the things that I did was I made sure that we have our seam allowance pressed back towards the longer strip. When we get ready to assemble the block, that's going to allow us to nest our seams, which is going to give us a nicer, even, flatter block when we get finished. Now, let's start assembling this block now that we have all the parts ready to go. The center section of the block goes together really easy, and this is forming our star. We have our middle square, and I'm using all the same fabrics, the same blue here, so we have a nice even look. We're going to join flying geese units onto opposite sides of that center G square, and then we've already added our corner pieces onto the flying geese units, and those will get stitched onto the top and the bottom. And when we finish up, we'll have a unit that looks like this with our star block on it. This is going to need to measure 4.5 inches square. So when we're building blocks bigger, we already made sure that our flying geese units were the correct size. I want to make sure that this is the correct size so that if we've got anything that isn't quite the right size, we can get it fixed and trimmed while it's small, because otherwise, if it's too large or too big, that's just going to grow as we work through the quilt and making the block. So using my cutting grid, just lining up my center line. If we need to be 4.5 inches square, that means the center is going to be at 2 1/4. 4.5 divided by 2 would be 2 1/4. So I'm lining up my 2 1/4 right there on the centers of the flying geese unit. And again, just pulling just a few threads off there. Again, lining up this side, trimming just a few threads. And this is what we want to have happen, that we're not trimming a lot off. Making sure that our points are 1/4 inch from the edge. Just a couple stray threads there, and one last side. Okay. We now have the center star of the block trimmed to size. Now it becomes building kind of like a 1/4 square log cabin. We'll sew our first strip on to the right-hand side, and then we'll come back with a pieced unit here coming across the top. So we framed out 2 sides, and we're just going to continue this process of building and sewing strips on. As we're sewing, we'll press this seam out towards the strip we just joined, so that will nest with the seam at the top, and just continue building out and building out. And when we get finished, pull all this away. There we go. When we get finished, our block will look like this. And I'm going to flip it over so that you can see the back. We've got all of the seams pressed going the same direction coming this way. All of these seams pressed coming the same direction this way. And you'll notice right here are those nesting points so that we don't end up with a lot of bulk right here in those seams. Now, our finished block is going to be 8.5 inches square. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my cutting mat to measure that at 8.5 and 8.5. Flip around. I'm showing just a little bit here on the edge that needs trimmed. There we go. So pulling off just a little bit. Pulling off a few threads when you're squaring up is what we want to be able to do, or we want to be within just a couple threads of our measurement. If you're looking at 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch off, then we need to flip over and take a look at the back side of our block and really start looking at our seam allowances, making sure that they are an accurate 1/4 of an inch. If you're getting seams too deep or too shallow at this stage, it's really easy to go back and adjust them, so that way you know that the block is the correct size, so when we get ready to put the whole quilt together, we know it's the correct size too. We're going to end up, to make the entire quilt as it's shown, making a total of 30 of the Old Glory blocks. Once you get done making all of your blocks, the next step is going to be to assemble the quilt. And we're going to start with the center section. And this is going to be assembled into rows. And what you'll be referring to is your assembly diagram. And on a quilt like this, where we have the same block, but we have it positioned different directions, the rotation is different. I like to use either a design wall, lay it out on the floor if you don't have any pets that will interfere with the layout. I do. So I tend to go to design wall, but even the top of a table or onto a bed works really, really well to let you get the entire quilt laid out to make sure that all of the blocks are positioned exactly where they need to be. If you don't have that big of a space, then work one row at a time and make sure you label. I normally do upper left as it row 1, row 2, row 3, so that you've got that exact position and orientation. But basically what we're doing is twisting and turning the blocks so that we're creating some secondary patterns here. And one of the advantages of laying everything out to start with is right here I've got 2 like fabrics side by side, and that kind of bothers me. So what I can do is switch the position of the blocks, or the placement of the blocks, so that I've got all of my fabrics distributed the way that I want to. So that way we don't end up with some darker fabrics in one corner, lighter ones in another. And a lot of that plays back to our fabric selection and making sure that we've got fabrics that all work well together with each other. So first step is stitching all of these together into our rows. Then we'll be doing a process of adding just strip borders onto that to continue growing your quilt. And this is in the assembly diagram. Then we have some beautiful pieced borders on this quilt. And piece borders are such a fun way to add visual interest to a quilt. By the time we have gotten our quilt to size, we want to make sure that we take some really thorough measurements, folding it in half and getting both the measurement of the length and also the width. And when we're piecing our borders together, laying out our strips, start with our corner strip, and really going for that super scrappy look, making sure that we've got blues, we're coming in with a red, then maybe a cream or a beige, then back with another blue, and not necessarily repeating it, and making sure that we're not spacing in the same fabrics, but that we're really mixing up our fabrics, our prints, and continuing down the line when we do that. Now earlier I mentioned that we want to make sure that this piece border fits exactly. We've got everything cut to size, but in the process of assembling that quilt top, we may have some seams that are a little bit thick or a little bit thin. And if you are off a 1/16 of an inch in your seaming, and you do that 4 times over a quilt top, now you're off 1/4 of an inch. Or if you're off 1/8 of an inch and you do that 4 times, now you're off 1/2 of an inch. So an easy trick that you can do is when you're piecing these together and you've got your piece border measurement and you're lining it up with your quilt and it's either too big or too small, not lining up exactly right, we can go in and re-stitch one of these seams by making it just a little bit deeper or a little bit shallower to take up and to get us that exact custom fit. When you get done with your quilt, it's quilted, it's washed, no one is going to know that you have done that. So just a quick little trick to make sure that all of your piece borders are fitting exactly the way they should be. Continue out the process of adding the piece borders and adding that final border, and you know what? You're done. Your quilt top is finished. And then the final step is referring to quilting basics. That's going to get you through the process of layering, quilting, and then also binding your quilt. Easy as that. Yes, this is a little bit bigger quilt, but with that one block, wow, what a wow factor you are creating that is going to be simply beautiful. As we're wrapping things up today, if you remember, I shared earlier that I had a special surprise for those of you who really like the star pattern, but just aren't keen on the rustic look. Well, guess what? I made the exact same block in a traditional Christmas red, green, and gold colorway. Isn't this fun? Yep, same pattern, same block, new colors. Just substitute the fabrics in the material list and follow the same instructions. Easy as that. You can make this quilt in any colorway you want and just simply make it your way. Again, I want to thank you for joining me today. I had a great time and I hope you learned a lot too. Make sure you share any photos on Annie's Facebook page, on Pinterest, on Instagram. Really easy to do. Just add the hashtag Annie's so we can see and share your photo. And don't forget, Annie's Craft is on YouTube also. Be sure to check it out. Again, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and I hope to see you soon again in another Annie's video class.